You are listening to the We Need to Talk About Oscar podcast, and this is our conversation with Robert Kaplow, writer of Blue Moon.
If something touches your heart in some profound way, and you're a writer, you're eventually going to get to it. You really are. And, I just knew that that story was so complicated emotionally that I was going to explore it.
To begin with, other than the obvious structural differences, what's different for you about writing an original screenplay compared to writing, say, a novel?
Well, I mean, it really is different. It's, in a novel, you have so much opportunity to be inside somebody's head and to bring the reader inside somebody's head in their chain of thought. And in the screenplay, I think you still want the reader to be in somebody's head, but you have to do it in a way that they can enter the story in a way that doesn't feel like you're overwhelming them with exposition or you're overwhelming them with background material. Films are in this present tense. And so that was the challenge to do. And it was an interesting challenge and one that I thought from the first draft to the final draft, that Richard Linklater and Ethan Hawke were very useful to me in trying to make it more cinematic.
And what does the development process look like? I mean, from the point where you have Linklater and Hawke with you when you're working with the director and the lead actor simultaneously, like how does the script evolve from then on when you're hearing it read aloud versus earlier when you're working in isolation?
Yeah, no, it made a big difference. The first draft that I showed them, which I showed Richard anyway, about, I'm thinking 12, 13 years ago before the film was made. He had it a long time. He liked it and, he showed it to Ethan, who liked it. And I met with Ethan Hawke in New York and we talked about it. And then we went to Ethan Hawke's townhouse in New York, Linklater, Hawke and I, and just over the course of 2 long days, just read the thing out loud, every single line. I mean, they were reading it and I was there with a pen in my hand, fixing things and saying, we don't need this, and they would say to me, I think we said this already. I think the viewer's going to get this already. We don't need to explain it again. Which was good. It was useful for me because I said the first version I showed them is probably 20 minutes longer than the version we ended up with. And so that was, and then we didn't do that once. We did that many times. We read the script. And then I would then go in isolation, as you said, and work on it again and just, to satisfy myself, say, I can get this joke better. I can make this speech more touching. I can explain her character more. And that was interesting. It was interesting to read. And because there were, only 3 of us for the most part reading this script over and over again, we would play different roles in it. And that was interesting too, to see, to actually speak the lines, because there was no woman among us. I always played the role of the girl. And I think I made that part better by just realizing, okay, she needs more to act here. She needs more to transmit what she's feeling, which was interesting. I remember, there's a long 14-minute scene between Lorenz Hart and the girl in a coat room at the end of the movie. And we were doing that scene in Ethan Hawke's house. And, he's a real actor. He puts the script down on his lap and he's using his hands and he's emoting as an actor, even in the privacy of his living room, and I'm not an actor and I'm just trying to read the lines without fumbling over them. And I remember we're doing that long scene and, I'm playing the part of Elizabeth and I look up at one point and he has tears in his eyes, Ethan. And I thought, this is just extraordinary, that I'm doing a love scene with Ethan Hawke and he's crying and I'm a middle-aged man doing this scene with him. And you just saw that, maybe that's what actors do, is that they invest themselves completely in the work. And that's their gift. They do it without a great deal of self-consciousness either.
And when you're writing about real people, Hart, Rodgers, E.B. White, where is the line between historical fidelity and dramatic license for you specifically?
Yeah, I fall on the side of dramatic license. And I think when I wrote the novel, me and Orson Welles, there's a disclaimer at the beginning that says, although this novel is set against the background of real people and real events, those people and events have been substantially altered in the interest of storytelling. And I felt that in this property too, that, I wanted to be true to what I thought were the spirit of those people, but not necessarily true to, an exact duplication of the word. First of all, there's no record of the words that were said. History tells us that Lorenz Hart went to the opening of Oklahoma. That seems to be something that really happened, and that he applauded wildly and put on this brave face. But I don't think there's any evidence that he went to the after party afterwards to celebrate. I think that may have been too painful for him to actually do. But in my story, it worked very well. Just I was trying to show him toughing it out and putting on this brave performance that his career was still ongoing and still strong when all the warning signs were there that it was ending. So to answer your question about where's the line, I think as a writer of historical fiction, the technique is to make the line so seamless that it appears invisible to the reader or the viewer, and that the viewer accepts the fictional side because you can't really see the transition. And so you begin to buy the whole thing and say, well, this must have sort of been what it was like,
And then you put these near 50 years of pretty much a lifetime and this larger-than-life personality in one location, Sardi's restaurant, in one night, on, as you just mentioned, the opening night of Oklahoma. What does the constraint of time and place mean for you as a writer in this situation?
No, that's a good question. And I think for me, it amplified the significance of language, because that's the only commodity you have to deal with in that situation. And I always felt very grateful that nobody in the course of making this film ever said to me, Robert, why don't we get out of the bar? And I thought somebody would. I thought somebody would say, listen, Elizabeth tells this story about this disastrous 20th birthday on Yale and, New Haven, Connecticut, and she's down in the basement of this frat room and there's this lamp with the horses on it. Why don't we why don't we go there? Why don't we see her in that frat room with that boy? And I mean, I had a good answer why we shouldn't do that, but I'm glad nobody actually tried to push me or strong arm me to do that. Because to me, as I said, it amplifies the language. And so part of their relationship, I thought, between Elizabeth and Larry Hart was they're both a little drunk on language, both of them. And I think that's why they like each other. And so, you know, when Hart is telling the story to his friends of who Elizabeth is, that she's this art student, and he stops the story and he says that, you know, she's at the Yale School of Art, and he goes, bohemian goddesses in gray smocks mixing paint in morning light. And he's saying that just for the joy of conjuring that scene out of language. He's a magician and he's conjuring that scene out of language. And I think in the same way, when Elizabeth finally tells him the story of her 20th birthday, she doesn't say, well, you know, we tried to have sex and that didn't work. No, it's a much more elaborate story. There's a ginkgo tree and the leaves are beautiful against the black bark that's dark from the rain. And there's a fingernail clipping of a moon. And this is the flannel shirt that he's wearing. And they're in this derelict bar. You know, I mean, she's doing the same trick that he's doing. She's not a professional like he is. But I think that's part of the joy in their conversation. Now, Hart, I think, misinterprets that as she's in love with him. And she's in love with him in a way, but not in the way that he would imagine or would want to be. But it's part of the engine that I think fuels their friendship.
And I never for a moment watching the film thought to myself, gosh, get to the point already, because it just flows in such a way. And even the speed Larry talks with and how that drives the plot, even though there is this manic, anxious energy to him, there is also the rhythm. Was that tempo on the page? And if yes, how do you emphasize or materialize that?
I think it was on the page. And I think what Ethan did was to find variations in the tempo of that language so that the audience wouldn't feel, when is this speech going to finally end? When is he going to stop talking? I think that was, and I think Ethan brought a lot of his sense of theater to that, you know, that he just understood that to get an audience to watch a 14-minute scene with two people, it has to have dynamics to it, you know. And I remember I was in Ireland when they were rehearsing the film. They shot it in Ireland, and they were rehearsing it for about 3 weeks before the cameras rolled. And I was there for about 2 weeks of the rehearsal. And I remember sitting in the production room having lunch there, and Ethan came in one day and he said to me, you know that scene, the coat room scene? He said, I think that should start where they're standing. And then when she tells him the story about Cooper and her boyfriend, they're sitting. And then when it finally gets to the big point about, you know, how do they feel about each other, they're sitting on the floor next to each other, sharing a drink. And I thought to myself, that's really nice. And I wouldn't have imagined it like that. But I think he, as a theater guy, he thought you really have to take the scene from here to there and pull the audience with you along the way. And I think he was right. And in the same way, during those long scenes where where Hart is arguing with Rodgers, or sort of arguing with Rodgers, Richard kept saying to me, give me lines for people to interrupt them along the way, because it's an opening night and people are going to be doing that. And, you know, the fun part for me was, instead of just having people, great show, Dick, great show, you know, to try to invent these little characters So there was an investor who comes up and says, well, it's about time the Theater Guild had a hit. And then I thought, well, it's Oklahoma. I'm going to send the mayor of Oklahoma City here. So I looked up who was the mayor of Oklahoma City in 1943. I found out who it was. And now he and his wife are in the movie. And I think, again, it makes that scene, those scenes more alive and more tense because, they've got this personal psychological battle going on, one that they've probably had for 25 years. But it's also opening night, and everybody wants to get close to Rodgers and share in, what they smell as an enormous victory coming down the road here, They want to be in the shadow of this tremendous success.
And to come back to emotion, sort of connected to the language, the challenge you set for yourself in creating the voice of this lyricist, who could have written My Funny Valentine, I Wish I Were in Love Again, and mixing or marrying his comedy, his irony that are in those songs with the deeply romantic and sad undercurrent of that loneliness and rejection we learn about in this little over 1.5 hours.
That was what you just said was the challenge for me in writing this, because there are, we're now everybody who writes, there are hours of interviews with them and you can hear their voice. There's none of that for Larry Hart. There's a corny movie that Rodgers and Hart made in the late 1920s, a little 18-minute film short, and it's they're reading lines that are scripted for them. It's terrible. There's a few radio appearances from the 1930s where you hear Lorenz Hart's voice on the radio, but again, he's reading these terrible scripted jokes mostly about how short he is. It's actually painful to hear the jokes. But as you said, the challenge is, can you create a conversational voice for this guy that you would say, as a viewer of the film, you'd say, oh yeah, that's the guy. That guy could have written My Funny Valentine. That guy could have written Nobody's Heart. And those songs that are funny, and right beneath the humor is this tremendous sense of longing and aloneness. So the challenge was to give him a speaking voice that was all that stuff.
And last but not least, but also to go a little bit back in time, because you've mentioned how this project and just the script had been around for 12, 13 years before getting it made. But if my research is correct, your interest in Hart goes back even further.
Yes.
Way, way further.
Yes.
So now in hindsight, with the film in theaters, how do you look back on finding that fascinating back then, that Richard Rodgers interview that made you think, I want to write about this, and the fact that you never let go of it for 3 decades?
Yeah, 3 at least. I mean, it just shows you, I suppose, that if something touches your heart in some profound way and you're a writer, you're eventually going to get to it. You really are. So this was in my early 20s that I heard that interview with Richard Rodgers. And, I really was fascinated with songwriting. In my 20s, I thought I might want to be a songwriter. I was that fascinated by it. And, I wrote fan letters to Richard Rodgers, who wrote me back. I have 2 of them when Rodgers was still alive. And, I just knew that that story was so complicated emotionally that I was going to explore it, and I remember finally, right before I wrote the first draft of this thing, just thinking, I have this character in my head who needs to talk. And I remember buying a cheap school notebook and a ballpoint pen because I write by hand. And I just started on page 1 and I let this, I took the brakes off and let this thing go. And by the time I was done, I had a character that spoke for 100 pages without stopping. And from that, I saw, okay, there's a story I can craft from this that has kind of a beginning, a middle, and an end. And that's what I worked with.
And thank God you did. Listen, Robert, thank you for your time, and thank you for this, because this might as well be my favorite screenplay of the year. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed talking to you. I really did. Thanks for the intelligence of the questions.
Thank you. That means a lot.